Thank you, Mr. President. It is my distinct pleasure to participate in this open debate on sexual violence and conflict. Let me begin by expressing my gratitude to Deputy Secretary General Mohammed and Special Representative Patton for their briefings, and our Peruvian counterparts for the work they have put into the organization of this year's debate. I also want to sincerely thank Ms. Sultana for her courageous work and her powerful testimony. Canada is supportive of your activism and stands with you. Today, I'm pleased to speak on behalf of the group of Friends of Women, Peace and Security, an informal network of 54 interested member states chaired by Canada, representing all 5 regional groups of the United Nations. We are outraged by the persistent and widespread occurrence of sexual violence in armed conflict by state and non-state actors. Sexual violence is being used as a tactic of warfare and a tactic of terrorism, and is a flagrant and unacceptable violation of international humanitarian law and of international human rights law. Among the many concerning country situations documented in the latest Secretary General's report, the sexual violence inflicted against the Rohingya is especially appalling. It demands a swift and concerted response from the international community, including in meeting the needs of the survivors of such violations and bringing those responsible to justice. Above all, we must do more to prevent sexual violence in conflict from occurring in the first place. We encourage the Security Council to give due consideration to the early warning signs of sexual violence in its monitoring of conflict situations. Indeed, preventing sexual violence is part of conflict prevention and sustaining peace. We must ensure that related expertise, including gender advisors and women protection advisors, are provided the access and resources needed to fulfill their critical tasks in peacekeeping operations. Cooperation with local civil society organizations can also help identify precursors, risks, and prevention and protection strategies for sexual violence in conflict. Furthermore, the implementation of joint communiques, action plans, and national policies to curb conflict-related sexual violence play an essential role, and we are encouraged by the progress of a number of states in this regard. Justice and accountability are means of prevention. Indeed, a climate of impunity discourages reporting, undermines assistance, and abets further violations. We therefore call for accountability for crimes of sexual violence in armed conflict. This in turn requires effective investigation and documentation, legal assistance to the victims of sexual violence, as well as adequate legal and evidentiary framework to prosecute such crimes. Moreover, accountability and prevention of sexual violence should be included in peace agreements, including, where appropriate, in transitional justice mechanisms promoting justice, truth, operations, and measures to prevent their recurrence. Amnesties should not be granted to perpetrators of sexual violence, and sexual violence should be explicitly prohibited by the terms of ceasefires and peace agreements. We recognize the invaluable contribution of the team of experts in building national capacities to enhance accountability for conflict-related sexual violence. We welcome the landmark ruling in the ICC in the case of Bosco Intagada, and note the recent surrendering of Al-Hassan, wanted for crimes against humanity and war crimes in Mali, including rape and sexual slavery. In contrast, it is disconcerting that not a single member of Daesh or Boko Haram has been prosecuted for sexual violence crimes to date. We emphatically call on the Security Council to explicitly include sexual violence as a designation criterion within the United Nations sanctions regimes, where such crimes are persistently perpetrated. Relevant sanctions committees should also be supported by dedicated gender and sexual violence expertise and draw on information from the SRSG for sexual violence in conflict. In all our efforts to ensure accountability, we must not lose sight of the needs and rights of survivors of sexual violence and conflicts. Greater efforts are needed at all levels to ensure that survivors have access to the full range of livelihood, social, legal, psychosocial, and non-discriminatory medical services to promote their rehabilitation and reintegration into their communities. Fundamentally, we are of the view that systemic gender-based discrimination, such as the exclusion of women from political life, economic marginalization, and discriminatory systems of both formal and informal law, is conducive to sexual violence in conflict. Any serious effort to address sexual violence in conflict must confront this fact. Lastly, we condemn in the strongest terms cases of sexual exploitation and abuse in peacekeeping operations and in international assistance, as well as sexual harassment within the UN. We encourage the Secretary General to ensure that common standards are developed and implemented across all UN entities to better prevent and respond to all cases of sexual exploitation and abuse. Mr. President, please allow me to make some additional points as Canada's representative. We meet at a time of great uncertainty in the world where an astounding proportion of the global population is living with conflict every day. These people are not living at the outer edges of conflict, but are fully immersed in the ugliness of war. 2017 was an alarming reminder of how the rise in conflict and the rise in violent extremism continues to trigger patterns of sexual violence. The disproportionate effect of violent extremism on women and girls is evident in many conflicts. It was especially brought to the fore of Canadians' mind when we heard of the terrible atrocities carried out by Daesh, including against Yazidis, who suffered a particularly high level of violence. As a result, Canada made a commitment last year to provide assistance to over 1,200 vulnerable Yazidi women and children and their survivors, and other survivors of Daesh by resettling them in Canada. This was an important decision that we can be proud of. But sexual violence and conflict around the world continues. As the Secretary General highlighted in his report, and I quote, "Wars are still being fought on and over the bodies of women." Women in conflict stand as courageous survivors of violence, not victims. We must harness their resilience, their determination, and their innovative solutions to find ways to end conflict. We commend the courageous women who lead us out of conflict, but we must resolve collectively that these crimes must stop. Canada is particularly alarmed by the plight of the Rohingya women and girls in Myanmar and Bangladesh. For the first time this year, the Secretary General's report specifically named the armed forces of Myanmar for patterns of sexual violence in conflict. Women there have talked about suffering sexual trauma at the hands of both the Myanmar military and those who support it. Canada has already sanctioned Major General Mang So under Justice for Victims of Corrupt Foreign Officials Act for his role in the oppression, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity against the Rohingya minority in Myanmar. Even after fleeing Myanmar, many women and girls continue to face gender-based violence. Their movements within refugee camps are often restricted for fear of being abducted for trafficking or forced marriage, harassment, and sexual violence. As Ms. Patton reported to this very council in December 2017, every woman or girl she spoke with during her visit to the camps and settlements in Bangladesh, and I'm quoting here, reported having either endured or witnessed sexual violence, rape, gang rape by multiple soldiers, forced public nudity and humiliation, and sexual slavery in military captivity. These are indications that this pattern of widespread and systemic sexual violence has been used as a tool of dehumanization and collective punishment. I thank Ms. Patton and the rest of today's briefers for being a voice for survivors and for their courage and leadership. I cannot emphasize enough that these horrific actions must be addressed directly by the international community, for there can be no impunity for those who inflict such callous and indiscriminate violence against a civilian population. Rape has been used as a weapon of war against the Rohingyas. Our briefers have spoken of this heinous violence, and Canada's Special Envoy, Bob Rae, also spoke of this tragic reality in the report he published earlier this month. All UN and international institutions must be mobilized to bring the perpetrators to justice. Today's debate is of critical importance. We are hopeful that together we can find a way to ease the suffering of all those affected by this crisis. Through its feminist international assistance policy, Canada is supporting UN Women to rapidly deploy experts to ensure international organizations and transitional justice processes are able to investigate and prosecute incidents of sexual and gender-based violence in conflict-affected states. This includes deploying a sexual and gender-based violence investigator to the Human Rights Fact-Finding Mission for Myanmar. Accountability for crimes of this nature must be our priority. It is why we urge the Security Council to systemically incorporate sexual violence as a specific designation criterion in UN sanctions regimes where such crimes are persistently perpetrated. And why we call on the Council to ensure that the issues of women's rights and sexual violence be consistently and adequately addressed when establishing and renewing the mandates of United Nations peacekeeping and political missions. Among its 5 objectives, Canada's National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security focuses on preventing, responding to and ending impunity for sexual and gender-based violence and sexual exploitation and abuse. It seeks to meet the specific needs of women and girls in humanitarian settings, including the upholding of their sexual rights and access to sexual and reproductive health services. Through our action plan, we want to empower women and girls economically, socially, and politically, so their voice can be amplified. We know they are powerful agents of change. Our duty is to remove the barriers of oppression and discrimination. Societies in which women and girls have an equal voice and equal rights, benefit from equal opportunities, and live in equal safety and security are far more likely to reject sexual violence. Canada is grateful to Special Representative Patton for her efforts to raise alarms about sexual violence trends globally. We appreciate the work done by the UN team of experts on rule of law and sexual violence and conflict. And we thank civil society organizations, many of which are here today, for the ongoing good work they are doing to stop sexual violence and hold its perpetrators to account. Civil society and women's movement are the backbone of our societies. Canada calls for justice for the survivors of such horrific crimes. Our response ought to be holistic and centered on the survivors. We must support communities in Myanmar and in Bangladesh. But most importantly, we must ensure that reproductive health, psychosocial, and legal services are available to these communities, as well as sensitive and coordinated documentations of cases. We must act together within the United Nations and other institutions to defend the rights of all people to live free of sexual violence and abuse. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency.